Hi everyone, my name is Ben Wright, human cartoonist extraordinaire, and welcome to another creator interview for Universal Flaws of Robotics. If you are just joining us for the first time, Universal Flaws of Robotics is a comics anthology all about automata. We have 19 creators, or excuse me, 19 stories. We got 24 creators, all telling their takes on robots, ranging from slice of life to transhumanist terrors. It is currently up on Kickstarter at the link scrolling across the bottom of the screen and in the chat description. And yeah, we've currently passed the 23% mark. Things are going strong. And if you're interested in supporting us, we highly encourage you check that out. And today we are joined by Catalina Rufín. Catalina contributed the story The Body Electric, has worked with us before on What the Gnomes Know, and is just a generally all-around awesome cartoonist. How are you doing today, Catalina?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm thrilled to be part of this anthology. I really enjoyed working on the last one about gnomes, and yeah, I'm just like excited to be on board.
Yeah, it's funny. I was watching back over that interview to refresh myself. One of the things you brought up is that as soon as you heard that it was going to be an anthology about gnomes, you were like, my wheelhouse, I'm in. Like gnomes, fairies, all that stuff. How did you feel when we told you the next one was robots?
I was excited because robots are not really in my wheelhouse. I've never done a comic about robots before, and I've never created like a robot character. So I was like, okay, this is going to be kind of a challenge, but I'm up for it.
It's always interesting when you get a pitch like of any kind, because even if it's not something you've normally worked on, you kind of just go challenge and accept it, and you got to dive in, right?
Yeah, I love having limitations or like some kind of thing to go off of.
One of the things that was also interesting listening to that was there was a lot of talk about being an outsider and things like that being a common theme in a lot of your stories. And I was thinking about that a lot listening to it, because Body Electric kind of has a very different take from something like Gnome Pizza, your story from the previous anthology. Just in that it feels like it's painting a world where the main character is an outsider, but the world itself is a lot more hostile. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I ended up going in like a more serious direction. And I thought it was like a really good challenge to push myself to say something like a little bit more serious and kind of I don't know, like I guess like a more social justice direction. And I think part of that was influenced by my new career field, which is working as a preschool teacher.
How long have you been doing that? I don't think that was what you were doing a year and a half ago.
Yeah, exactly. So I started in May 2022, which was I think like shortly after I turned in my gnome comic. And so the thing about this job is that it's kind of like a very like emotional tasking job. Like it's all like dealing with children, supporting them, and then also like interfacing with parents and families. And I was kind of found myself relating a lot to like nurses, especially in that you're you're doing like such a like essential basic human care, and you're also doing a sort of like customer service type of work. Like what's interesting about nurses maybe more than doctors is that they're really connected to like the day-to-day care of the patient, and they're like kind of constantly checking in, and they're like the first line of like basic care. And I also have several close friends who are nurses, and when I was working on this comic, I actually like ran my script and thumbnails by my friend who's a nurse. I was kind of like, hey, like, does this resonate with your experience? And she said, oh, yeah. Like, she was telling me stories about patients who were just kind of like horrible to her. And she was talking about how she's unionized, and they recently had like some issues and were going on strike for better pay, and that nurses really have to deal with like people lashing out at them, and they have to have security there at the hospital, and they have to kind of develop like a very like kind of like a lot of boundaries and barriers to protect them from like some of the negative emotional harm that can happen.
Yeah, I absolutely get that. My dad, his whole career was a doctor, and like his nurse practitioners were some of his favorite people. Like, they really do run things in an amazing way, and I can't imagine some of the stuff they had to deal with. Like, I remember my dad mentioned that there were stories of like having racist patients harassing some of the nurses and stuff like that, and they still have to treat them because it's part of what happens, and just all this. They really do take the brunt of a lot of it, and they do a lot of the most important work.
Yeah, so I kind of was seeing like both in my as my career developing as a daycare worker, and like kind of watching my friends go through their careers as nurses, seeing just like becoming very aware of like these systems and like how they kind of treat workers as like expendable bodies, like, oh, we just like, like, and it's like the physicalness of the job too, like you're kind of being exploited, like, what happens if you like get really injured, like you have to take care of your body as well, because it's so easy to be injured, and then like you have to deal with like workman's comp, and like how is this going to work?
Right. I love that you mentioned the feeling expendable and or replaceable, because that's the exact thing I had queued up for
Mm.
a sample from Body Electric. Just the idea that these nurse robots can be at any point shelved and replaced. So one thing that also interested me, it looks like you went with watercolor again, but as opposed to Gnome Pizza, which had vibrant color scheme, lots of colors. This is primarily a blue comic, and I'm curious why you chose to go spot color with this.
Yeah, so when I decided that this comic was going to be set in a hospital, I have a very strong association with this kind of like minty green, almost like a teal or a turquoise with hospitals. Like it's kind of like common for like scrubs to be like this sort of colors. And the walls and everything medical. So I just went like, okay, that's going to be my palette. And I really have also like different emotions with colors, like they I think of things, and like blue for me, it can be like a sad color, like in some of the darker moments, like you have this like darker blue, and there's kind of also like a quietness that I was getting when I was working on this, and I wanted to have like, I guess, an emotional response that's like ranging from like, I guess, like a kind of like pathos, but also like a little bit of like kind of cheerful hopefulness, like the way that the robot character Phoebe like is always smiling, and like despite everything is still kind of an optimist, kind of trying to get like a range of feelings. And I felt like the softness that I was getting from the shades of blue and the pencil like was effective for that.
It's funny because one of the things I think I remember you mentioning previously is that one of the parts that was important to you is that her face always smiles. Like it's built to only be able to smile no matter what's going on.
Yes.
And it was interesting because it felt like you really do get across a lot of emotion considering the face never changes.
Yeah, that was a really interesting challenge for me, because a lot of my other work, I really focus on facial expressions. I'm like fascinated by like how to exaggerate them, how to effectively communicate facial expressions. And so, really when you think about like these like mechanical creatures, a lot of them don't have the ability to have a changing facial expression. It's like they're made out of some kind of inorganic material. So I thought it would be really cool to have Phoebe just with always the smile, like that customer service smile. And when I was designing the character, I kind of thought of Phoebe as a little bit like a doll. One of my kind of background inspirations was this old anime called Chobits, which is about these like anime girl computers, and they're kind of like girlfriends, almost like girlfriend bots. And I was thinking like, oh, they're always like kind of cute and smiling. And so I felt like Phoebe and the nurse bots were like a little bit of that. Like they're supposed to be cute and approachable. And so kind of my workaround for the permanent smile was to focus more on like backgrounds. So I have like a few scenes where like Phoebe's like kind of depressed about something. So the background's like all these like pencil lines and darker blue. And another one where like, oh, they're a little happier, and there's like some little like excitement lines. And I had a lot of fun too with like the thought balloons. Like there's a few where like one of the other staff are insulting Phoebe's friend, another nurse, and she just has like a little like skull and crossbones thought balloon. It's kind of just like she kind of thinks in these symbols. Oh, and another one, she just has like the heart eyes, like the literal emoji, because that's kind of how she sees the word and world, and that's how we understand her emotions.
Trying to see if I can bring up that skull emoji, because I remember that and it's great. Yeah, I do like that. It's interesting because it involves unionization and protest themes in this story, which on one level is kind of funny because some of the most recent unionization and protest things have been in response to generative AI. And it's kind of cool seeing the robots wanting to unionize.
Yeah, I do think that with the story and with a lot of robot stories, robots end up representing people or like an aspect of humanity. When I was working on this comic, like robots were kind of like the vehicle. Like it was more of like, I'm gonna have fun with like the robot concept because I love sci-fi, I love robots, and I was just kind of having fun with that creative aspect. But I do think that the robots symbolize a lot of different types of people. Like I was thinking about like a lot of like immigrants who are employed because like the employers are thinking like, like it's cheap labor, they don't speak English, and they don't have like the same like protection as like an American citizen. Or maybe certain people with disabilities who are kind of treated like lower because of those disabilities, and because like they're not seen as being capable workers. And I think about like a lot of other ideas where like something like Blade Runner, for example, where like the robots symbolize like some kind of oppressed class of people. So it really is like very symbolic in that sense.
I definitely get that. I found an example. It's not specifically the skull one, but I think this kind of captures it as well.
Yes, that like fear, the fear emoji.
As someone who worked in customer service, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you get to see the contrast between like her customer service voice and like the inner fear of dealing with this person.
It is also nice that the whole thing, despite having interactions like this in it, like genuinely upsetting and prejudiced and scary reactions, it very much is a story of hope.
Yeah.
Like that optimism doesn't feel misplaced in the character. It feels like it's interesting because it's a story of someone who can't express themselves normally through facial expression or anything like that, learning to have a voice.
Yeah. When you put it that way, it kind of furthers a little bit like the connection to disability. Like, not to say that it's like a literal like one to one, because I think that
Of
those
course.
comparisons
Mm-hmm.
can kind of don't always work and they're not always useful. But I really like it when you can have like multiple readings of something. Like, if you're reading this comic and you really identify with the robot, let's say as like an autistic person, like I think that's really awesome, and I like it is like a little bit intentional. Or if you get a different interpretation or like a different connection with the robot characters, like maybe someone who's like maybe has a chronic illness or another physical disability where you think about like, you know, your body and like how to take care of it and things like that. So yeah, I'm like looking forward to seeing like how the story could resonate with people in different ways.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that was brought up in the when we were all as a group talking about our different stories and things like that. This wasn't brought up specifically for the Body Electric, but I do know that one of the other members of the group who's on the spectrum expressed concerns that sometimes robots are used as basically an excuse to talk about autism without talking about autism.
Yeah.
And I know autism features in your work quite a bit. You've talked about that openly in the last interview. So it's kind of interesting that that's something you actually really connect to and like.
Yeah. I write about it from my personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
And like kind of some of the like, I guess, microaggressions that I've experienced. Um, yeah, I do think that like it could be like in like kind of like mainstream media, it's like, oh, we don't want to like try to have representation, but we're gonna create like robotic or like non-human characters. But on the other hand, I really enjoy and appreciate when like people from within the community identify with characters and latch onto them as
Mm-hmm.
representation. Um, and so I think like I can do a little bit of both, where like I'm also like putting my own experience, but also I'm inviting people to project that as well.
Yeah, and I think it's there's something very personal in how all this is put together that really makes it work on a lot of levels.
Thank you. Yeah, I
Uh,
guess
mhm.
oh, I was like flipping through and I remember there is a scene where Phoebe is performing CPR, and I was like, I had just taken my CPR class. I was like, oh, I'm gonna put that in the comic, because like it's such a like fascinating medical thing, and I felt like I was able to like add another little personal dimension. Yeah, that's the one. And I was like, oh, I just learned about like how to place the pads and how to properly do the hand technique, and yeah, I was just like excited to do that.
Yeah, I'm giggling a little because for some reason the tiny little smiley face with "I'm getting a pulse." I don't know why that kills me.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. I mentioned this in one of my last interviews, but I've started noticing robots in my daily life more often. Uh,
Mm.
and one of the main examples is there's I don't know if you know BJ's Wholesale. They're not everywhere in the nation. They're kind of like Costco.
Yeah, we have a couple
Yeah.
here.
But they actually have an inventory robot, like just this pillar that can move across the floor. But it's
Oh
programmed.
yeah.
It's programmed with a face like that. Like it has a digital face that pops up, just so people
Oh
interact with it better.
yeah. There's this sushi chain called Kura Sushi. There's
Mhm.
one in my town, and there's a bunch all over the US, and they have a little robot that gives you drinks. It's very mechanical. It doesn't have like any like it's looks kind of, I guess, like the like Eve or Eva from Wall-E, but
Yes.
with
Mhm.
no facial features, but it just kind of like goes around and delivers your drinks. I think because the chain, they're based in Japan. I think Japan has a lot more robots kind of in daily life, and so they kind of brought that aspect over to the States.
Yeah. Half their military is mechas, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think they're kind of like um more advanced in robotics, I think, because when I was looking at robots, like I was looking at a few real robots for inspiration, and they have a few that do a lot of like human interfacing, like human services. Like
Mhm.
they have a few that work in like elder care, like people with memory loss, or in like hospice care. And they do kind of have this like slightly creepy, like permanent smile. And there's a little bit of that uncanny valley aspect where like their movements are a little bit similar to humans, and they have these like faces that are very cartoony. But I guess for the people there who are in this care, it's really helpful for them to socialize. They have kind of like a safe social interaction with the robots, and maybe like maybe they don't always know like if they can tell if they're human or not, but I think it's like a very comforting interaction. So it was cool to see that going on there.
That on its own is actually kind of an interesting concept. The idea that people in elder care might not recognize the difference. It's like an easier version of the Turing test.
Yeah, I've also heard that they have like kind of like those little animal robots, like the cats, and they're like covered in like they're almost like toys, like they're like
Mhm.
those little robotic toy pets, and those also help them to stimulate some memory because like they're kind of have like a responsibility to take care of this pet, but like if you don't feed it, like it's okay, but it like helps to have the routine of like taking care of the animal, and it's like cute and it's comforting. So
Yeah,
it's like cool to see robots in this like emotional context, not just performing manual labor, but like seeing them in a friendly way like that.
very humanizing in a sense. One thing, shifting gears a little bit, we were talking about this right before we went live, but you mentioned that you do playlists with your work.
Yes, music is very important for setting the scene, kind of like the emotions that I'm feeling and that I want to create when I'm working on the comic.
Mhm.
Um, and because I really like 70s rock, there's a lot of like sci-fi stuff out there. So the title of the comic, The Body Electric, is a Walt Whitman
Mhm.
poem, which is more about like the human body and like all the things that it's able to do. It's kind of like an ode to like just being human and the most basic human functions. Um, and there's also a song by Rush that's about robots. I think it's about like I believe it's about like a servant robot and who's kind of busted out on their own. Um, and I think it's based on like probably a different sci-fi story. I feel like a lot of Rush songs are based on like different like sci-fi stories and movies and such. So, but that was like an inspiration. And I just love the idea of the body electric. Like, that's really what all these robot stories are about. And then I was also listening to Alan Parsons' project. They have an album called I, Robot, which is, I think, probably drawing a lot of inspiration, of course, from Asimov, I, Robot. I'm actually not familiar with that short story collection, but I went a lot to the Alan Parsons album, and there's a lot of like really nice kind of like melancholic music. I felt like in the more emotional scenes, like it worked really well. And there's a lot of cool like synthesizers and stuff like that that kind of goes with the technological aspect of robots. So yeah, definitely like listening to a lot of electronic synthesizer music. And then another one more artist that I'll mention is the Buggles. They have this like song called "Video Killed the Radio Star," which is, yeah, it's very much like that theme of like technology like taking over things, like things changing. Like, you don't have radio, you have like TV now. But they have this album, I think it's called something plastic, like Life in Plastic or something. The Plastic Age, that's what it's called. And it came out in the early 80s. And, you know, I feel like the early 80s was peak, like, technology is changing our world. And so they have this song called "I Love You, Miss Robot." And it doesn't have like anything to do with my story. It's kind of like this like love song between a human and this robot lady who's very like aloof, and because she's a robot she doesn't have like the capacity to love or something like that. But I don't know, I just was like really thinking about like robot human relationships. That album in general like really felt connected to this theme.
That's definitely awesome. And you're right. Like the 70s and 80s were a really interesting time for this, because the 70s had a big, like, kind of retro sci-fi movement. There was a big boost in like a lot of the classic pulp style science fiction. And then the 80s started getting much more into like cyberpunk dystopias, and like you mentioned Blade Runner before, like the dark corporate world where technology was being mistreated and maligned. Some of the groups have been talking about the Tezuka movie Metropolis, which would have come out around then too.
Yeah, I feel like I have to mention Mr. Roboto. Just, I don't know.
I thought of it.
Yeah, it's like the elephant in the room. I was like vaguely aware of it as well. And the funny thing about that whole concept album is that like it's this guy like disguised as a robot, but he's a human. He's in the song, he's like, I'm not a robot. It's stuff. And like it's kind of like this idea that I think a lot of bands had in the 80s, where it was like, oh, like, is technology destroying rock and roll? Which is like just kind of ridiculous. Like, I don't know. Like, if you want to know more about that album, there's a video essay on YouTube called Train Records that I recommend.
Todd in the Shadows, yes.
Yeah.
I was like, I was wondering if that's who you're going to mention.
Yeah, exactly. I think it like sums up all the problems with that album.
And there are many. It's funny because as soon as you mentioned Video Killed the Radio Star, I got mad that I didn't remember the band name, because I've watched that One Hit Wonderland.
Yeah, it's a fun little song, especially to think about now. It's like technology keeps moving forward, and like the music industry dramatically changes.
It's true. That actually leads conveniently into one of the other things I wanted to talk about, and it's something I'm bringing up in all my interviews. So one of the big hot topics that in the anthology itself we generally try to avoid. In fact, this is a good time to mention the anthology uses no generative AI, like none. Like, besides the fact that, you know, Kat's work is drawn by hand. Even those of us who did digital art, we drew it ourselves. We did not use generative AI in any of this. But it's interesting because a lot of people are having conversations about how generative AI is being used, what the future of it is, what the problems are, what the benefits are. And I'm just interested in everybody's take on it.
Yeah, I do not support it because I think a lot of people, like artists, definitely feel like afraid that like their art is being used in the like the sources, and that it's taking away jobs from artists, and that people are kind of just like cranking out like really kind of hideous material with a lot of this AI art. It just like there's just something off about it, like in a lot of little details. I think it's also important to note that the environmental impact is pretty significant, kind of similar to the debate around NFTs, where people were talking about like how, you know, to generate NFTs requires a lot of computer server work, and you know, all the energy that's going into generating that, it uses up a lot of natural resources. And I think the same goes for AI, especially like on a larger scale. It can be really damaging, and it's using up a lot of resources. So I think on both of those fronts, against it. And yeah, I just think like it also feels a little bit like people think that they don't have to, that it's like a shortcut, like, oh, I don't have to like be creative, I can just like type in a bunch of stuff and it'll generate something. And I feel just sad for that so many people think they can't be creative and that they can't be artists. Like a comment that I get a lot from people is like, oh, I wish I could draw like that, like, oh, you're so creative, like I wish I could be creative. And it's like, you know, I think everyone has that potential. Like I really try when I have conversations with people to like be really encouraging and say like, you know, if you just have that passion, like you will want to create something. And even if it's just a little like, oh, I wish I could like draw like a cartoon, or I wish I could draw anime style or something, like I think that I hope that we can encourage more people to draw and just be as open as possible. And then hopefully if people feel less like they're being gate kept from being artists, that we then don't have to rely on AI to let people be creative.
Yeah, I definitely get that. I know several people who've told me that who are currently artists or cartoonists, and they said if they were in high school and generative AI had been around then, they might not be where they are today because they would have just done that instead of learning how to do it.
Yeah.
And that's definitely like a scary thought in some ways. I am eternally the optimist and hope that this technology with a little regulation becomes more useful to us than hurtful. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like it's doing that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of problems with just like places stealing and not crediting, like they're just kind of scraping people's art without consent. You know, there has to be limits to everything, and you know, I'm sure like I think in some other fields people are using AI in a way that's very helpful. You know, actually my cousin is a nurse and he was talking about some of the programs they use that are using AI to help kind of make their work a little bit more efficient. You know, as long as things are being done with care and that there's a lot of regulations in place, then it can be helpful. We're just trying to figure that out with the art side.
Yeah. Medical AI is definitely an interesting field. A lot of it is being used mainly for initial diagnoses and things like that. It still requires a human element, but it can massively reduce the lookup time or research time that might have been previously necessary.
Yeah.
That
I
said,
don't
it's
know.
also not replacing doctors.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's good that that there are like humans involved in the medical process. I think it's very important, and I think like you know, if my comic was like a real life situation, I think people would be like pretty jarred and maybe like upset that like, oh, you're not being seen by like a real human nurse, like it is like a robot. And I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's really the right way to go. I think that because like that human connection helps people so much. Like people feel a connection to like the doctors and nurses who are helping them.
It is kind of funny because once the whole generative AI conversation really started getting off the ground, it made me think of every sci-fi story I ever heard where it's the robots just trying to be accepted, but the humans are bigoted and won't accept them. And then as soon as the actual AI shows up, it's like we're all like, "Oh, this might actually be a problem," and like we're all bigoted now.
Yeah. I guess people were really affected by like Space Odyssey 2001. They're like, oh, we don't want
Yeah,
Hal. Whatever you do, we can't have Hal.
we don't want the singularity. Keep that away.
Yeah, yeah, that too, for sure.
One thing that prompted me to think of bringing up this question when I did is you mentioned the music industry. One of the things I've been learning is that the music industry is one of the few bigger industries that's actually been having some success at fighting back against generative AI. And it's mainly because they already have tons of legal coverage set up for people stealing music effectively. And
Yeah,
they've been
that's
able
really
to bring
good.
that to bear. In addition, like the bigger corporations in the music industry actually don't want people just randomly generating music because that's how they make a lot of their money. So they've actually been effectively fighting for their smaller musicians because they need that industry to stay in place.
That's really good to hear.
It is unfortunately scary for people like us who are completely indie.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like the art world is less organized than the music world that has all these like big record labels and things like that.
Yeah, it's you don't exactly see cartoonists lobbying Congress, although wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah,
We'd have the best picket signs. It would be incredible.
yeah, that would really be interesting to happen. Like I wonder, like just I don't know, like what would set it off.
Oh man, what would set it off? Cartoonists finally getting unionized or getting a guild, one of the two.
Yeah,
That would
yeah, it
do it.
would be nice to have like yeah, just like a little more organization. Um just like I don't know, it feels like so much of what I'm doing as a cartoon is just kind of on my own, like just figuring it out as I go. Especially like publishing is like there's just like just a few, and then like if you don't get into those small few little boats, you're just kind of like doing your own thing. But you know, I feel content doing my own thing right now. You know, I'm in this anthology. I'm in a few other ones that are coming out. So you know, for now I'm feeling happy where I'm at.
Yeah. It's funny because that kind of isolation is absolutely a cartoonist thing. So many
Oh
people I
yeah.
talk to, the reason they do comics is because you can do everything if you want to. Like I started out originally looking at potentially pursuing film, but that was always like, okay, I write a screenplay and I give it to somebody, and now they get to do all the work and they interpret it and they come up with all this stuff. And it's not what I came up with. I just gave them the starting
Mhm.
point. And I was like, but comics, I can write it, I can draw it, I can do everything if I need to. And increasingly, especially with these anthologies, I started to realize it's kind of more fun when we all get together.
Yeah, I joke that
Like we
comics
actually
are
network.
perfect. They're perfect for control freaks,
Yes,
especially
absolutely.
self-publishing, where you're in charge of every aspect, all the cover and the end papers. That aspect of it has been pretty fun. For a while, I was sad that I couldn't get published by like first, second, or something, but I was like, but on the other hand, like if they kind of have to choose the cover, like marketing team has to choose a good cover, and it's like, oh, if I don't like the cover, like I would not feel happy selling this as my work. So I get to choose a cover and a design for my work that I really am proud of.
Yeah. It's funny. There's the thing I always like to tell people, just because I feel like I didn't understand this properly when I graduated from Center for Cartoon Studies, was I, if you like working with publishers, yeah, you give up a lot of autonomy. They are going to make a number of decisions for you. You're not going to be making as much money per book as you might be making otherwise, things like that. But what you're basically doing is, in a weird sense, you're paying them to handle all the stuff that's not cartooning. And there is value in that. Like if you're able to do the hustle and you're able to be your own publisher, your own publicist, your own printer, your own marketer, your own agent, if you're able to do all of that yourself, great, self-publish. It's fantastic. But if you don't want to do all that and you just want to draw, you can't. And that's what working with the publisher gets you.
Yeah, I agree. That part of it can be really hard. I feel like what I do right now, like I feel is like a little bit minimalist. Like I do conventions. I don't do like tons of conventions either. I try to do like one or two big ones, like let's say SPX in DC, that's a big one, or TCAF. And then I'll do maybe like a bunch of local shows. And I've had my comics also for sale at a few stores in Massachusetts. And then I like post regularly to Instagram, but I know there's people who do like a whole lot more. Like, they're doing like crowdfunding for their comics. They're like always like running a web comic. They're kind of posting to multiple platforms. But what I've come to see in my work is like I feel like I'm very committed to being like a local cartoonist, like local to the Boston scene and connecting with like other people in that area. So I feel like comfortable where I'm at, and I feel like if I did a lot of self-promotion, it would be exhausting, and I maybe wouldn't have as much time for art or just like time to like recharge. So I think I have a pretty good balance. And this year is a good year for me. I'm actually, I feel like I'm hitting like the big guys of comic conventions. I did TCAF, Toronto Comic Art Fest in May, and then I'm getting ready to do Cake Chicago in August and SPX in September in Maryland.
That's pretty exciting. Like you just named some very big shows.
Yeah. And Mice is my hometown Boston show. I won't be tabling, but I'll be helping to organize as part of the staff. So
Nice. Have you done staff on a show before?
I've done volunteering and I've helped to run a few workshops and panels, but this is my first time like kind of more in an official aspect. And it's great. I feel like I'm trying to like absorb information so that I can help to arrange future conventions. The more conventions there are, the better.
Yes, absolutely. Especially in the comic scene in particular. Like, it's one of the things that in Ohio we're struggling with a little bit, just because the main cons we had that honestly had some major indie friendly cred were the anime cons. We had Matsuri Con, we had Ohio Con especially, and there's been a Ohio Con in particular is some drama. I don't want to spill too much tea on a live stream, but look it up.
Okay. I know a little bit about this kind of drama, like Anime Boston and Arisia, the Sci-Fi Con have their fair share. Yeah, I also think that it can be hard to sell original indie comic works at these larger, kind of more like fandom expansive cons. So it's important to have one that's really dedicated to creator owned independent comics.
Yeah. It's funny, because anime cons, for whatever reason, were always the exception for me. Like, those seem to do well, and people seem to be fine supporting indie cartoonists there. But anytime you go to a thing called a Comic-Con, almost every creator I've ever talked to said, yeah, we don't sell anything at Comic-Cons because no one wants to buy comics.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's good to know. I guess now that I think of it, it makes sense because, at the anime conventions, people are like, like even if they're selling fan art, it's still like stuff that they've created. And there is like a little bit more of a focus on art, I think. Like, I know Anime Boston, for example, we have an artist alley and we have an art show, and people are actually like selling their original comics and graphic novels. But then you have something like the Fan Expo, Comic Con scene, and that focuses much more on other fandom aspects and not really like artist alley.
Right. Like, and a lot of it's either the mainstream guys, especially with Comic Cons, you get a lot of people who are big DC Marvel fans specifically. And you get people who are interested in the movies and in the shows and in the cartoons more than they are the comics. And very often are there to see the celebrities who are in attendance. I want to be clear, I'm not knocking that anybody's into this stuff. That's absolutely great. It just makes it a little tough when you're in the artist alley selling. I do have a theory that I'm trying to spread to as many people as possible because I haven't had a chance to check it yet, and I'm hopeful it would work. Someone brought up the idea that maybe part of the reason those shows are tough on indie creators is because people who go to them go to comic shops and are used to $4 comics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially if like what you happen to be selling may be a floppy. And even some like a comic like our anthology, for example, that is technically a trade paperback, but is a little more expensive to produce than a typical diamond distributor trade paperback. Yeah, makes sense.
Exactly. It's why we got the price down to 25 for the Kickstarter, because we're hoping that'll maybe pull in a few more eyes.
Yeah, everyone watching should back. It's a great price. You get a great deal.
Yeah, and that is a sale price. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's probably going to be 30 at the end of the Kickstarter, so get it now while you can. But yeah, we are coming up close to the 50-minute mark. If anyone in chat has any questions, now would be the time to post them. We will be able to see your comments. But yeah, it's interesting because speaking of AI, digital spaces, stuff like that, one of the things that was, I seem to remember this did get brought up briefly in the other interview. Back when the lockdowns were happening, digital cons became a thing. Like actual conventions in online spaces, which I'm sorry to see it have mostly gone away because I thought it was such a cool idea. And I seem to remember you had some success with them. Is that correct?
I was at Virtual Mice, which was 2020, like September, October. It was like pretty low key. I think they were having like creators do like little video intros about their comics, and they were available for sale online. And I've heard about, I think there's still a few places now that are doing kind of like virtual comic fairs where it's more of like they kind of set up a shop, and for a limited amount of time you can buy the comics. You can either download the PDF or order them. I believe Shortbox continues to do that. They're based out of the UK. And TCAF this year had like the physical convention, and they also had the online one where it was the online marketplace, and some creators who weren't able to get a table could sign up for the virtual marketplace. And that's a good way to get a few sales and promote one's work.
Yeah.
I
didn't know TCAF did that. I should try that sometime because I usually can't get to Toronto.
Yeah, it's definitely logistically a lot harder, even if Ohio, I guess, would be relatively close.
Yeah.
I don't know my geography so well, I guess, but like...
I actually would need to think about it because I know you can drive to Canada from here. I just don't remember where it dumps you out.
It's probably like a really long drive still, but like just the logistics of the border crossing make Toronto just a little harder to access.
Yeah. Yeah. My understanding is you also have to say, like, I'm not going to sell comics because, like, there are weird issues with that.
Yeah, you have to like tell a little white lie.
Yeah. I'm always nervous crossing borders. I actually visited Montreal earlier this year.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, I got to do a little trip with my parents after a family reunion. But it was funny because while going through the border check, it's completely normal. You're there for vacation. You've got all your paperwork right. I always feel like I look like the most guilty person on the planet. You know what I mean? Like, you're just sitting there like, act normal. Act like you're not a criminal. It's like, you're not a criminal. It's like, I know, but act like it.
Yeah, I remember that when I was at CCS, Center for Cartoon Studies, a bunch of us were in a carpool to Toronto, and we had our whole story planned out. One of the group, Sophie Yano, was going to a Magic the Gathering kind of like convention or meetup, and so we agreed, yes, we're going to the Magic the Gathering tournament. And so like we were just like kind of telling the border guard, like we were saying like, oh, we're going to a card game. It's like, what is it? Magic the Gathering, what is that? And just like oh, how much? And we were just like started explaining. It's like, okay, yeah, bunch of nerds, just go.
Did he actually say that? Because that would have been amazing.
He was just like kind of cut us off, like, well, Magic the Gathering, it's like a fantasy card. Go.
Yeah.
We're not afraid of nerds.
Yeah. I was more expecting, like, he looks at your passports and then he puts it down and he taps it. Like.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that would have been great.
That's amazing. I've done one show in Canada. It was Montreal Zine Fest, I think.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, that was back at when I was at CCS. Went up with Danny Shooping. Good times.
Yeah, and I guess most people speak English or they're bilingual, so even the language barrier is like not a huge deal.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, I do know that historically there's been problems in Montreal between francophones and anglophones and things like that. And so just in case, I prepared how to say in French, I'm sorry, I don't speak French. I'm American. Do you speak English? And someone came up to me as soon as we parked and got out and started speaking French. I was like, désolé, je ne comprends. And they immediately go, oh, English. And they start talking English.
Yeah.
Like, but I prepared the rest. I can't say it.
Yeah. It's funny. In my case, I didn't even have to open my mouth and they knew I was Anglophone.
Yeah.
I tried like my high school French and they were like, oh, English.
Yep. I remember first time I got to visit Europe in high school. And, I was hoping to, use a little bit of the language, do my best. And I was fascinating how many people just came up to me and just started speaking English. And I remember asking one of the chaperones about it. I was like, how do they know we're American? And they say, your shoes. You're wearing sneakers.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah.
Oh, well. But yeah, we, I think, have pretty thoroughly gone off the rails. For anyone who's just joining us, this is an interview with Catalina Rufín about the story The Body Electric, which is contained within Universal Flaws of Robotics, a comics anthology all about automata. 19 stories all about robots, ranging from slice of life to transhumanist terrors. It is currently on Kickstarter. There is a link scrolling across the bottom of the screen in the chat info below, and there's also a QR code right above Kat's head. Kat, where can people find you on the internet?
My Instagram is Fairy Warrior Cat, link below. And I also have my main website is cargocollective.com/Catalina Rufín. I have some comics up there that you can read for free, and it has my email as well for any contact info.
All right. And you can find more about this Kickstarter, including other interviews at youtube.com/@canonwrite. We do also have a playlist we're putting together as new interviews are dropping, so you're able to just start at the beginning and watch all through them if you want. You can also support the Kickstarter at tinyurl.com/UFRcomic. We are currently at, I haven't checked during this thing, but we were at $2,098 at the start of it. We're shooting for about 9,000 by mid-August, so we're well on our way. This is the money after the first week, so we're doing pretty solid. You can also find my work at BWH Comics on Patreon, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. BWHcomics.com is also my website. All right, I think we are going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Anything else you want to say to everyone before we're done?
Back to Kickstarter. There's so many amazing comics, not just mine. It's like such a high quality piece of work. You're getting an amazing deal buying it. Like, just go for it. You're gonna love it.
Well, couldn't have said it better. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Next interview, I believe, will be on Thursday, so keep an eye out for that. And until next time, rock on, guys, and never stop drawing.